When it comes to superhero films, I put them into two categories. Those with artistic integrity and those without artistic integrity. Without artistic integrity, you have most MCU and DCU films. These films mostly being corporate blockbusters, which while sometimes enjoyable, rarely hold any artistic integrity at all. In the opposite category, I see two trilogies as standouts for superhero films with artistic integrity. These being Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy starring Tobey Maguire and Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy starring Christian Bale. Both these trilogies, while not perfect by any means, take artistic chances and have artistic integrity in my eyes. The standalone follow-up to Sam Raimi's trilogy was The Amazing Spider-Man, directed by Mark Webb, starring Andrew Garfield, and the standalone follow-up to Christopher Nolan's trilogy was The Batman, directed by Matt Reeves, starring Robert Pattinson. The Hollywood obsession with casting British men in American superhero roles I will never understand, but what I do understand is how similar these films actually are. I think The Batman is probably one of the greatest superhero films of the 2020s so far, and on the other hand, The Amazing Spider-Man I see as one of the worst superhero films of the 2010s. So today I'm going to talk about what makes one great and the other terrible, and the similarities they both share. Both Sam Raimi and Chris Nolan's trilogy spend ample time on the backstories of Spider-Man and Batman respectively. For Spider-Man, it's about the death of his Uncle Ben. For Batman, it's about the death of his parents. Audiences love these backstories because they're iconic. They are part of what makes each character so beloved. But honestly, now that most everyone is already familiar, it should have been a no-brainer for Sony to cut the backstory. But instead, in The Amazing Spider-Man, we spend way too long on a backstory we already know, and which comes off as a cheap knockoff of the backstory found in the Raimi trilogy. In contrast, the Batman forgoes the backstory and goes straight into story, which helps with the film's pacing and plot. This criticism is pretty obvious, but I feel like it should be mentioned anyway. Marvel and Sony even took this criticism to heart and cut the backstory for the MCU Tom Holland Spider-Man films. I feel it's important to mention because it's the first sign of why The Amazing Spider-Man is so bad. It shamelessly tries to copy the Raimi backstory formula, failing to add anything interesting. Conversely, the Batman throws out the backstory and focuses on diving straight into its story. In The Batman, Batman says the iconic line, "I am vengeance." Now this is actually important because it comes into play in the third act of the film. However, in the Amazing Spider-Man film, Spider-Man is also on a quest for vengeance. However, this quest feels half-hearted and unserious. In the Raimi trilogy, Spider-Man hunts down the man who kills his uncle, tries to kill him, and ultimately indirectly kills the man who kills his uncle. This sequence of events is intense and an integral part of the trilogy. Compare this to The Amazing Spider-Man, where Peter looks for his uncle's killer part-time as Spider-Man, all while quipping jokes, and he never even finds his uncle's killer. In fact, the vengeance plotline is dropped when the main villain of the film is introduced, the Lizard. In the Batman, it turns out Batman's vengeance is the inspiration for the main villain, the Riddler. Therefore, Batman's line in the first act about vengeance has a payoff. Peter Parker is usually a lovable loser before getting his powers, and this is how Tobey Maguire played it. But dare I say it, Andrew Garfield is simply too cool to play a lovable loser Peter Parker. You're really telling me that skater boy Peter Parker, who looks like Andrew Garfield, is a loser who has no friends? Yeah, I don't buy it. To me, Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker performance just comes off as awkward and unconvincing. Compare this with The Batman, where Robert Pattinson, when portraying Bruce Wayne, actually has an interesting spin on the character. In Chris Nolan's trilogy, Bruce Wayne is a playboy, but Pattinson plays Bruce as an outcast to society, a recluse. This take on the character, thought up by Matt Reeves and co-writer Peter Craig, is interesting in my opinion. It adds depth to the character. Personally, I like how both films handle each main character's love interest. I added this section just to show that there are things I like about The Amazing Spider-Man, believe it or not. In The Amazing Spider-Man, Gwen Stacy is actually a likable character, and she has agency. For one thing, she actually invites Peter over for dinner, which is a twist on typical gender roles. Gwen also has something to do in the third act other than being saved. She goes to Oscorp to retrieve an antidote crucial to the plot. Overall, Gwen is maybe one of the best written characters in The Amazing Spider-Man, which isn't saying much, but I'll take what I can get. Likewise, Selina Kyle is also a great character in The Batman. She cooperates with Batman, but does her own thing when she feels like she is being used, leading to an interesting dynamic between them throughout the film. In The Amazing Spider-Man, Richard Parker develops human-animal hybrid technology which leads to Peter becoming Spider-Man, but it also leads Peter to further develop the technology, helping to create, by accident, the Lizard, the main villain of the story. In the movie, Peter defeats the Lizard, but Gwen Stacy's father, a police officer, dies in the process. Peter promises not to see Gwen, but then goes back on his promise immediately, telling Gwen that promises you can't keep are the best ones. To me, this shows that Peter learned nothing throughout the film at all, and to me it cheapens the entire film. By contrast, in The Batman, Thomas Wayne indirectly gets a reporter killed in his quest for vengeance, and Bruce Wayne also has a quest for vengeance through his vigilantism. Both Thomas and Bruce are the catalyst for the Riddler, and by the end of the film, Batman realizes he needs to change his ways in order to truly have a positive impact on Gotham. Overall, I really do believe The Amazing Spider-Man could have been great. I truly believe that. If it cut the backstory, followed through on its vengeance plotline, rewrote Peter Parker to fit the actor casted, and actually respected its sins of the father, sins of the son theme, then it could have been great. The Batman is great because it's a film which clearly is a continuation thematically of what Chris Nolan did with his trilogy, but rather than being a retread, it actually builds on ideas set up by Nolan while changing and adding new material to justify its existence. That's all I have to say on these films. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll be back next Friday with a video about two filmmakers, both considered to be the best of their time. I'll be comparing and contrasting their filmography. I'll see you then.